I'd just like to complain to the organisers that I got the short straw. I would have never have dreamt that in my life of a number of varied things, primarily to do with economics and finance, that I would have been stood here talking about superbugs. So thank you to the museum, and thank you to all the others that have been behind bringing this really important thing, as you just heard so eloquently. 3.5 years ago, I was also somebody that could not pronounce antimicrobial resistance. In fact, it took me a few weeks. In fact, I didn't also have a clue what it was. The one and only Sally Davis, that you've heard mentioned already a couple of times, rather cleverly persuaded the then Prime Minister David Cameron that this indeed was such a threat to our and the next generations that we needed to have a big, noisy global review that would do something to stop that threat. And for reasons I'm still not entirely sure why, the Rolodex stopped with me. I am an economist by training, and the reason I was asked was to look at it from an economic perspective. My wife still says to me it's the first time in over 30 years that she has either understood or had any interest in anything I'm doing. I have taken a photograph of that first exhibit there because it mentions some of our numbers to show her that actually I did do something useful in life. I haven't seen the answer yet. But let me give you a little bit of a flavour of what we came up with and where I think we are on a couple of these things. So the reason why it's got a mention there is in our very first report, we showed that if we do not do something about this, by 2050, the year I deliberately chose because it's associated with me and the otherwise possible rise of the so-called big emerging economies, the BRICS, particularly China and India. We don't do something about it. By then, there could be 10 million people a year dying around the world. 10 million. Today, it's probably about 700,000. And in order to try and influence economic and financial decision makers, we also showed that along with that, the world would lose a staggering $100 trillion worth of GDP that otherwise, notwithstanding all the never-ending issues we all read and talk about all the time, would accrue to the world. So an enormous loss. That number of people that would die would be more than those that are dying around the world from cancer today. Importantly, in the context of Angela's own experience, 1/3 of those possible deaths would just be in TB because of the incidence with that dreadful infectious disease. So from that, we then went on sticking with economic and financial principles to try and think of what we could do to try and influence a world to stop that happening. And one of the many reasons why it is arguably, for me, the most interesting thing I've ever done, we came up with what we have subsequently called the 10 Commandments. 10 multidisciplined, interconnected ways, and I'll just very quickly say what they are. I would describe 4 of them as supply-boosting interventions. That is to increase the treatments to help either prevent or support people who suffer from superbugs. And that would be more researchers, more early stage R&D, new vaccines, something that the main sponsor here is actively involved in, and of course, crucially, new drugs. I would say over a year on from our review finishing and the high-level so-called UN agreements that our review contributed to, actually on 2 of those 4, there is, from my perspective, quite encouraging progress. There appears to be quite a lot more AMR research centres appearing around the world, particularly encouragingly here in the UK, which is quite basic. If we need more solutions, we need more people studying it. Secondly, and I think the reason why that is the case, is there has been a number of positive interventions to bring more early stage research, which would incentivize those early stage researchers and those that try to develop early applications. On the other two, in terms of new vaccines, and as Angela correctly touched on, new drugs, there is a lot of talk, in fact increasing by the week, but unfortunately as of yet I don't really see any real initiatives, despite universal acceptance of some of the proposals that we suggested. As important as all of those are, particularly of course having drugs that will work, perhaps controversially, but in my view, probably the demand reducing interventions are even more important. Because even if we find new effective drugs, because of the nature of these things, and the exhibition explains much more than I ever could as to why these things are so natural, what we need to do is stop treating antibiotics like sweets. And so, of the other 6 interventions, 5 of them are what I would call demand reducing. We need greater public awareness. What better than this? And adding to the wonderful tone of what Angela said, I was just thinking our population is, what, 63 million these days? What about a goal of getting at least 10% of our population to come here, which is only 6.3? Or, I don't know whether the museum does this sort of thing, but why don't you consider going on a trip to Beijing and Delhi, because these are places where it is crucial that just basic awareness of what superbug challenges are a crucial part of reducing the demand problem. Secondly, we need greater cleanliness in all environments. Sally Davis's famous washing hands. I'm sure a number of people here know this, but experts claim that in the time it takes to sing Happy Birthday twice, if you wash your hands in modestly warm soapy water, that would do an enormous amount for reducing the spread of infection. Thirdly, we need greater surveillance. In many parts of the world, including some developed countries, it is astonishing still how sparse the data quality is about the incidence and interrelatedness of infectious vulnerability. And then fourthly, as is shown in the exhibit, we need efforts not just in humans. In agriculture, the problem in some places is even worse, importantly the United States included, and probably in the likes of China and India. And in particular, it seemed to us in our review, in agriculture it's probably quite a lot easier for our farmers and others to stop using antibiotics like sweets than it is in humans. And there is a number of initiatives underway there. And then the last of the one that is really important on the demand reducing side, we need what I often refer to as Google for doctors. We need state-of-the-art diagnostics. Our lives are dominated by these ridiculous things, and yet we still allow and pressurize our doctors to guess whether we need an antibiotic or not. And there is endless amount of evidence of significant overprescription. So it's very pleasing that the Longitude Prize focuses so closely on diagnostics. And I would say at some time in the next few years, we need some sort of equivalent of what Alexander Fleming did to find the affordable state-of-the-art diagnostic that would allow perhaps our single most aggressive of our 27 specific interventions to enforce, in developed countries in particular, to set an example, that we get to a world where doctors are not allowed to prescribe antibiotics unless they've been through a state-of-the-art diagnostic test. We are nowhere near that yet, but we need to see significant efforts. Some of you will have figured out, who are excellent mathematicians, that those add up to 9, and I said 10. The other big thing, which is why it's important for the museum to consider going around the world, is none of that would work even if the UK did all those things brilliantly on its own. One of the things that this is such a fascinating challenge for, it doesn't distinguish between black or white, or male or female, or Sunni or Shiite. It affects us all, and we need intense, focused international cooperation to solve this. So I look forward to speaking to your travel agent shortly. Thank you very much.